So why don't we max out on isolation movements? Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here. I thought I would chat with you guys and gals a little bit about this today. And this is one of those where, it was kind of funny. I had someone in my comment section when I was had a video up about strength and getting stronger, and they're like, does this apply just to, big movements, or I'm assuming this doesn't apply to isolation movements like curls and calf raises. To which I kind of had a laugh, and it was funny because I wrote back. Of course, I had someone else chime in and say, well, why do you have to be condescending? I'm like, I'm not being condescending. I am actually just answering a question with a question, which is something the great teacher Jesus Christ was known to do, who I am an admirer of and a follower of. He used to do that. And I asked, well, have you ever seen me perform a 1-rep max or advocate 1-rep maxes on isolation movements? I mean, all my training is up. I'm just saying, right? Which, if someone stepped back and assessed that and they look at the reason why we max out, yeah, they'd kind of have their answer. Be like, yeah, no, I've never seen you advocate that, and I've never seen you do it. It's like, okay. So why wouldn't we then? Because if someone were to ask the question, that means people don't know the answer. Okay? And it's very, very clear that I've obviously never advocated it. So therefore, means I probably don't think it's a good idea. But why? I'm glad that you asked. Let's jump into why. All right, a couple things. Number one, why do we max out? Well, to improve coordination, right? Intramuscular, extramuscular coordination, learn movement patterns, okay? Right? When you think of movement patterns, I want you to stop and think, is there a real learning curve to doing a single joint? In other words, if I were to take your legs and lock them into a leg extension machine, strap them down to where you couldn't move anything but your knee joint, is there really a motor unit learning curve to that? And people would say, well, maybe a little, but not really. Is a single joint. Either you just compress hard or you don't, right? You either just push as hard as you can or you don't. Okay? And if you're not locked in, it's probably not going to be an isolation at that point. Like you try to max out on a curl to where you're not with your back up against a wall and locked in tight, it's going to turn into a compound movement real fast within the first second. Okay? So when you look at the studies on strength, what do we note on movements like that? That when they study in the lab, a leg extension, like a machine leg extension, to where they strap the people down and look at studies, there is a direct one-to-one correlation. There's an exact correlation between hypertrophy and strength improvements. Okay? Right? In other words, there's no skill component involved. If the muscle fibers of your quads get bigger, your force production on a true isolation movement goes up in direct proportion. There's no learning curve. You don't have to learn how to use the leg extension machine when you're strapped in and can't move anything with the knee joint, or a machine curl when it's locked in. This is what studies have found. Right? Your 1-rep max goes up in direct proportion to the percentage of muscle fiber growth. So it's directly correlated. And this is why we point out most of our strength comes from hypertrophy. Now, when people hear that, they say, but why is a bigger guy, sometimes they're not always the strongest? Because you're comparing two different people with different muscle fibers and leverages. For that person, for that identical person, the bigger versus stronger version of them, there will be an enormous carryover. And it's because when we're dealing at the single joint level, what do you think happens? It's purely muscle size. Like that is what determines how strong you are for you as a person with your bone structure, with your tendon insertions and your lever arms and skeleton. Okay? That is really all that matters, honestly. unless you get some sort of nerve damage or something that inhibits your ability to contract stuff. Okay. Barring aside injuries or something like that. So there's no skill to learn. Conversely, when we go over to bigger movements, there is a skill. In other words, practicing big multi-joint movements, even if they're not the exact one you're doing, you get stronger by training maxes. In other words, hitting lifts that are above 90% max do have a strength improvement. Why? Because you're learning the skill of maxing out. Maxing is a skill. Now, doesn't always have to be a high skill. And in other words, it's not something that takes 10,000 hours to master, right? But it is a skill. And if you practice maxing, your maxes will go up a little bit. If you're not used to maxing out or even doing heavy lifts above 90%, and you practice doing some for a little bit, your max will go up even if you don't gain any muscle. Because there's a skill component. Okay? But that's because there's multiple joints involved. In other words, it's a coordination. So that skill is a coordination issue, just like when you throw a baseball or throw a spear or swing a golf club, right? Or a bat. There's a motor pattern. There's a skill involved with that because of the multiple joints. And it's the same when we go to do these big movements. It's a coordination, right? It's coordination of you learning to use those muscles all concurrently in a pattern that's efficient and maintains a certain form, okay? And that's a lot of what we're doing with maxing, is practicing that. With a single joint movement, there's no real need for it. And there's very little, if any, benefit. But what's then the downside? Well, the downside being, guess what? It's also higher risk of injury. In other words, these small single joint exercises are more prone to injuries with truly heavy weight than a big multi-joint, because things are not dispersed across multiple tendons and joints. It's all being put on one insertion point, sometimes at one tendon. And if you go as heavy as humanly possible one time, there's actually a higher risk of injury. And I'm not saying it's a massive use of injury. It's not like, oh man, you're going to get hurt. If you do that 5 different times, you're just guaranteed to get hurt. No, it's not that much. But it is risky. So it's high risk with no reward. There's no payoff for it. You're not going to gain that much muscle from doing 1 rep maxes on a calf race. Okay? This is understood. But there's risk of injuries on doing this. You're maxing on your curls and stuff. There's a risk of injury. And people who say, well, what about the strict curl competitions? Guys tear their biceps in those all the time. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I'll talk to you guys and gals next time.